Fraser. Cam Fraser is Australia's leading men's sex coach. So I'll be speaking to Cam. Hopefully he'll be joining me shortly. Tonight's Instagram live is with Cam Fraser, who is a sex coach for men, obviously straight men, where he provides sex coaching, and he also provides some courses as well. He's the founder of Karma Wellness. So I'll be speaking to Cam Fraser. Hopefully he's going to be joining us from Australia. I'll just accept him. So again, just for the benefit of people, who is a sex coach, certified sexologist, tantric practitioner. He's a sex and intimacy coach for men, from Australia. Hi Cam, how you doing, mate? You all right?
Yeah, good. Thanks, man. Good. Yeah, I've just got my coffee and my little son's just cruising around in the other room, so you might hear him. Yeah, it's good to see you, man. Good to be back and chatting with you.
Likewise, bro. Likewise. What time is it?
Just on
Where
eight
you are?
o'clock. Eight
Okay.
o'clock in the morning.
Wow. Wow. Now again, thank you for taking the time to have a chat with me. Usually, what I like to do with all my guests is ask them to kind of give a very quick elevator pitch, just to kind of introduce who you are and the work you do, and we'll delve right into the conversation. So, if you don't mind.
Easy, man. So my name is Cam. I'm a men's sex coach, a sexologist, a counselor, a registered tantric yoga teacher, and as of the time of recording, I'm also the current deputy chair on the National Council for the Society of Australian Sexologists. I'm really passionate about unpacking and rewriting the mainstream stereotypical narratives around masculinity, sexuality, male bodies, and men's experiences of pleasure. I do my best to try and blend the scientifically validated, medically accurate information with the esoteric teachings from the mystery traditions of yoga, tantra, Taoism, and other schools from those classifications. So that's what I'm passionate about. That's what I do today. And a lot of it is really informed by my own lived experience as a cis het white dude, mostly in Australia, but with a little bit of traveling in between as well.
Lovely. I am listening, so I'm just trying to I want to type in your details and put in the pin so people could check out your great work whilst we're talking. Also, do you mind having just speaking about your podcast as well, and where people can access on what kind of things you talk about?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to plug the podcast, man. I always forget it, so I appreciate the prompt. So I have a podcast called Men, Sex, and Pleasure, which is essentially just a catalog of conversations that I have with people of various different professions that are kind of related to sexuality, psychology, men's work, all about essentially, as the title of the podcast suggests, men, sex, and pleasure, really trying to get into the nitty gritty and the nuance of like how men may be reluctant to experience more pleasure or feel shame around exploring their bodies, to talking with sex workers about the type of men that go and work with them or do some work with them. It's a really an opportunity for me to have some really interesting conversations with people that I don't think really get much of a voice in the like men's work, sacred sexuality, neo-tantra space. So it's about 150 episodes strong, and I've got heaps more episodes in the pipeline. So if you are interested in like this type of conversation that you and I are going to have, then my podcast is a plethora of other sources of information for you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, very good podcast. Is the podcast name actually called Cam Fraser?
It's called Men, Sex, and Pleasure with Cam Fraser.
Sorry, yeah. Men, Sex, and Pleasure with Cam Fraser. You can check it out on Cam Fraser's YouTube channel, but the YouTube channel is Cam Fraser, right?
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
at the Cam Fraser on all social media platforms.
Cool. So yeah, if anyone just Googles Cam Fraser, you can find all the information, and also on your website, camfraser.com, where it's got access to your courses, which I want to touch on a little bit later, like especially the 6-week course, Outperform the Pornstar. I want to talk a little bit about that, what that entails, as well as obviously is it the Karma Wellness Foundation? Is that correct?
Yeah, I've got the so it's an institute, so it's a teaching
Sorry.
institute. So I train
Yeah.
up other sex coaches who want to work specifically with men. So I've got a whole certification around that as well. And yeah, happy to speak into that. But yeah, I've definitely got the Outperform Pornstar, which is what I'm super passionate about promoting, and really proud of the content in the Outperform Pornstar course as well. I think it's got a lot of great stuff in there.
Cool. Now we'll touch on that a bit later, but I just wanted to plug in your services first, and then we'll get into the conversation. We'll plug in your services again.
Thanks, man.
So let's get into it. So obviously you've been a sex coach for a number of years. What inspired you to become a sex coach?
Yeah, so I've been doing this for almost 10 years now. And as I alluded to before, it's really informed by my own lived experiences. So like as a teen, 16, 17 years old, I was living in Australia. I moved to America at the age of 17. So I went on I was a collegiate athlete and I was able to get a scholarship over to American University. And so I really had this experience of, being in the locker room, stereotypically, that kind of macho machismo locker room type of energy. I was a soccer player. So it was like a lot of English fellas in there as well with me, South American guys. And it was like a lot of banter. But when it comes to like sexuality and masculinity in particular, the phrase that comes to mind, the approach that I had to sex at that age of my life was every hole is a goal. And it was much more about quantity over quality. And so the sex that I was having was really performative in the sense that I was like overly concerned with lasting a long time, with trying to get an erection right away and being afraid of not getting erection, a lot of anxiety around my sexual performance. What if my mates found out that I was shit in bed or all this other stuff? I was really concerned about what the other young men in my life thought about me. And if I boil it down, I was really afraid. I had a lot of fear around being ostracized from my male friend group, of not fitting in, of being seen as lesser than, as being seen as less of a man, of being bullied, right? And I feel like a lot of men experience that fear, right? Of like not fitting in with their male, friend group or their male peers. And so I had a lot of mental health issues at that point in my life because I was doing my best to fit in, and that included drinking a lot. In fact, that was my way of really fitting in. I was kind of known with my friend group as the guy who could drink quite a lot. And so there's about a period of 4 or 5 years where, every time I had sex, it was under the influence. There's probably 4 or 5 years where I didn't have sex sober once and really relied on alcohol as my kind of gimmick, right? I was kind of the Australian larrikin heavy drinker that, all my mates would, prop up for that particular quality. So needless to say, that heavy drinking also had an impact on my sexual experiences. There's plenty of times where I experienced alcohol-induced erectile dysfunction, or if you like, whiskey dick or brewer's droop, right? So I was intoxicated to the point where sex just wasn't, really pleasurable, or I couldn't really feel anything anyway. The alcohol really numbed me out. And then, on the flip side of things, that's how I was dealing with my anxiety. So anxiety just got perpetuated, right? And I started feeling more anxious about being sexual, or more anxious about my masculinity, or not being man enough, and all this other stuff. So it was this really negative downward spiral of my mental health and like how I showed up as a young man. So very serendipitously, I injured my lower back. I actually fractured my lower spine. And as part of my rehabilitation, I had to do clinical Pilates and yoga and massage and just do all these embodiment practices essentially to get back to a state where I could play football again. I could play soccer again. And so it was through those modalities, I suppose, those embodiment works, that I was, that I slowed down for the first time in my life. And I listened to my body. I learned how to breathe. I learned how to release tension from my back and from my pelvis. I started to notice the sensations in my body, stuff that I'd been like closed off to for such a long time, because that's not what you do as a young man. You don't pay attention to how you're feeling. You don't talk about that sort of stuff. You drink, you have banter, you just go out with the lads. It's not, really encouraged. But I was starting to be encouraged by these like physical practices. And so I noticed that there was a couple of times within these classes, for example, where, I was holding a yoga posture, and because my back was so sore, I was getting frustrated by not being able to hold the pose, but that frustration very quickly kind of boiled over into rage, and I was just like super angry at not being able to do this particular pose, right? Because I was injured. Just disproportionately angry at myself, right? And then during Pilates classes, I remember doing an exercise on the reformer where I'm like really having to be controlled and quite slow. And I remember just welling up with tears and just bursting out crying. And, at the time, I was about 19 years old. I was like, holy shit, I can't let my mates know that I'm crying in Pilates, or getting angry at yoga. I've got to go and sort this out. I need to get rid of these emotions. That was my thinking at the time. And so I went and saw a counselor, and then the counselor put me onto a psychologist. And I did narrative therapy with a psychologist for many years. And I'm still lucky enough to, I can afford to go see a psychologist today. So I still see a therapist today. I think it's, if you can, everyone should. But my experience with narrative therapy at that time, for those that don't know, was essentially just like taking stock of all the stories that I told myself about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a sexual man, what it means to be, show up in this world as a man, and kind of sifted through them and said, well, do I agree with those stories? Do they actually serve me? Do I actually want to follow those stories? And then, the next step from that was like, well, the ones that I don't agree with, the ones that I don't feel are beneficial for me, can I let go of those? And can I write new stories for myself? What do I personally want to show up like as a man? How do I want to be sexual? What do I want to express my masculinity like? And creating new stories for me that felt a lot more authentic and a lot more genuine. And so I was doing all this at around the age of 19, 20. And I had this like combination of talk therapy through the psychologist and like body work through Pilates and yoga. And it had a very transformative impact on my life. I started, in the most compassionate way possible, stop giving a fuck what my male friends thought about me, right? I just was like, you know what, man, I don't care. This is what feels good for me. This is what feels right for me. This is what I'm authentic in. So I'm just going to do it. I don't care what you fucking think. I lost a lot of friends during that period of my life as well, because I started drifting away from the really ladsy kind of alcohol oriented culture and started doing much more of my own, personal development stuff and really stuff that was really interesting to me. And then, and so my relationship with men changed, but also my relationship with women changed as well. So, I'm attracted to women, I have sex with women. And so my, sexual relationships with them were much more oriented on pleasure and connection and intimacy rather than on performance and whether my dick was this big or whether I was lasting this long or whatever, right? Rather than focusing on the performative aspects of what sex, quote unquote, looked like, I started focusing more on what sex felt like. Felt much more comfortable talking to my partners, asking them what turned them on, if they had toys, right? If they needed lube, like just being more curious about pleasure, being much more secure in my masculinity, asking those things and being open about what I desired and what turned me on and whether I wanted to have sex or just wanted to cuddle or just wanted to like go down on her and not have anything in return. Like just being much more communicative because I felt much more confident in myself and who I was as a man. I wasn't scared. And then, this is all kind of, again, happening at the age of 19, 20, 21. Long story short, I studied psychology at the time. So I got my degree in psychology. I went and did a diploma in counseling, went and did a postgraduate degree in sexology. In between all that, I traveled quite a lot. I was very lucky to travel to South America and Southeast Asia, do some plant medicine ceremonies, do some exploring of Eastern philosophies. I became a yoga teacher. And, again, I'll wrap this up because I recognize I've been talking for a little while, but I got to the point where I found sex coaching as a modality. I used to work as a support worker for people with disabilities. I used to work as a counselor for relationships, used to work as a yoga therapist, but I found sex coaching and it allowed me to really draw on a lot of these different practices that I had incorporated into my own life and that I found really transformative and powerful in other people's lives. And sex coaching just allowed me to do all of that, rather than being confined to just massage therapy or just talk therapy. The coaching space, I could draw on a lot more. So that's where I'm at today, man. And a lot of the stuff that I do today is stuff that I wish 10, 15 years ago, someone had told me, that someone had given me the information about. So a lot of the work is, in a sense, like healing a younger version of myself, that kind of like younger version of Cam needed to know this stuff, needed to have an older guy who just like knew what he was talking about, was compassionate and shame-free and non-judgmental. That's the type of guy that I try and be today for other men, regardless of how old they are. And very typically, I find that a lot of guys resonate with at least one part of my own personal story. So that's why I share it in at least that detail. So that's pretty much it, dude.
Oh, fascinating story. I mean, there's a couple of things, more than a couple of things that actually I did resonate with, and I wanted to we'll ask you a couple of questions on some of the things that you said to kind of expand on. So when you mentioned, especially the locker room, especially even for men and also for women as well, because I'm sure men will know exactly what you're talking about with the whole concept of every hole is a goal, because that's the same. I mean, that was the same for myself when I was growing up. But how did you, from that mindset of obviously being sex, it's all about quantity as opposed to quality, and sex being quite performative. where that mindset or that kind of outlook of looking at sex, where do you think that came from? Was it just from your male peers? Was it society? Was it pressure from maybe from female partners? Where did that come from? That's the first question I want to kind of unpack with you.
Yeah, I think you touched on like, you know, the majority, like it comes from a lot of places. I don't think there was just one specific place that it came from. I think like there was an expectation from my male friends that this is what it means to be a man, right? Like that was something that I adhered to. And like I said before, I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be outcast. And so because my other male friends were doing it, I just, you know, I followed along. I didn't have a lot of integrity in myself. So I just did what others did. So that was like one pressure. This is, you know, the social pressure from my peers. Another one was like movies and TV shows and pornography. So like media in general, I kind of lump pornography as an extreme version of media into that category. You know, I think of people like Joey Tribbiani from Friends, right? It's like the epitome of like always on the prowl, you know, always being, you know, interested in sex, always pursuing sex, right? That was like, that trope is very common in movies and TV shows. And once you like clue into it, you can't unsee it. It's like everywhere. Every male character is always doing something to get the girl or to get sex or to get laid, right? It's like, especially like young teenage, you know, male movies like American Pie and, you know, all these other like, especially like that, like late 90s, early 2000s, when I was like going into my teenage years, that was the plot line of all the movies, was like how to get laid, right? So very one-dimensional male characters. And that's like, okay, that's what I got to do. That was what I was modeled, you know, so I just did that. And then I think there was like, you know, an internal expectation as well of me. You know, I've shared this before, but like you know, there's instances in my life where I didn't want to have sex. I actually didn't want to be, you know, explicitly sexual. Maybe I didn't want to have penetrative sex, you know, penis and vagina sex with, you know, a young girl that I was with, you know, when I was a teen. But because I had internalized those expectations of what it means to be a man, I just did it anyway. I pushed past my own resistances. I pushed past my own boundaries. And if I'm brutally honest, I probably, because I wasn't listening to my own boundaries, probably pushed past women's boundaries as well during those years of my life, because I wasn't asking questions. I was just following a script really blindly. And so like I you know, just followed those expectations. And you know, part of that as well is like, there was times in my life where I you know, explicitly said no to sex because maybe I was too drunk or I was too anxious. And, you know, I didn't want to say no, but I did say no. And I had reactions from these young women, again, during that, you know, teenage period of my life, who said to me, what, are you gay? Like, what's wrong with you? You know, kind of like shaming me for not wanting to have sex as well. So there's an expectation that I only had on myself. Not only was it there, but it was also an expectation that women had as well, that I should be pursuing sex, that I should always be interested in sex, that I should just be initiating as often as possible. So I felt it from multiple different avenues. And I feel like it's a pretty strong story that a lot of guys think about themselves or think about men in general, is that they, you know, are always DTF, right? Like that's like the kind of mentality that we have about, especially straight dudes, and even more so for gay men as well, right? Gay men, they have this really promiscuous stereotype, which is not correct as well. So it gets exacerbated by, you know, by certain demographics. But yeah, that's kind of where I feel like the story came from, was a bunch of different places altogether, just kind of reaffirming it and compounding it.
Yeah. On the because that was actually one of the questions I was going to ask, but since you kind of mentioned it, like this idea or the myth that men are always up for it and always DTF, as you put it. Is that something which my question was, is that true? And obviously you clearly answered that it's not true. But do you think that's changing in terms of maybe more women are appreciating or getting to understand that there are times when men aren't interested or not in the mood, and it's not necessarily something that's wrong with the woman herself, especially if they're in a relationship or what have you. But that's something that I've noticed that a number of men do find it quite difficult to navigate that. They're under pressure, they feel they have to always be up for it, especially if their female partner initiates. So I'm just wondering, is in your work that you're doing, are women becoming more receptive or appreciate in terms of understanding the nuances in male sexuality? Because I don't really hear that much, to be honest, especially in mainstream amongst sex educators and sex therapists, speaking about sometimes men are just not in the mood. And it's not necessarily because he's depressed or he's lost a job or whatever. Sometimes he's just not in the mood, the same way sometimes a woman's just not in the mood. But is that something, have you seen much change in terms of people appreciating nuances in male sexuality in that respect?
I think there's been a bit of a shift. I think part of that is because, I think part of that is because there's been a lot of empowerment in women's work and in women's spaces and women's sexuality. Like, I think historically, there's been a experience that women have had of connecting their desirability or their even self-worth and self-esteem to whether a man is turned on by her or not, or desiring to have sex with her or not. And I still get this when I work with couples as well. Like, for example, if he says no to sex, obviously one of the retorts could be, what are you, fucking gay? Which is what I received when I was a young man. But one of the other ones is, well, don't you like me, right? Don't you find me attractive, right? Because the assumption internally or intrinsically is he will always say yes to sex. Men will always say yes. They'll always be, it doesn't matter if it's good sex or bad sex, they'll just go because any hole's a goal, right? That's the mentality that not only men have, but a lot of women have that mentality as well, because that's what they've come to kind of expect and internalize of men. And so because of that, if he does say no, or another example is if he maybe doesn't get an erection straight away, a lot of women connect their self-esteem and their sense of attractiveness to his sexual desire or sexual response. So if he isn't interested in sex, she might feel, oh, he's not attracted to me anymore. Oh, I'm not sexy enough for him, or I'm not enough, right? There's something about me that is the problem because he doesn't desire sex, which, I mean, could possibly be true, but that is most often the case not true, and is very often just down to him not being interested in sex, just the same way that a lot of women in certain circumstances and situations also just aren't interested in sex because we're human beings. But that narrative can pop up in those self-doubting ways, right? Of like, well, I'm not, and even guys as well, right? I speak to guys about like the times that they sometimes don't feel interested in sex. They go kind of like, what the fuck's wrong with me? Right? Why aren't I interested in sex? Am I broken? Is there something wrong with my libido? Right? Because they didn't want sex one time. They think now that they're like, broken. And I think that like, beyond that as well, there's like there's kind of this over pathologization of male sexuality as well. It's like, if you don't have like a high, unwavering, unyielding libido and you want to have sex all the time, then, a lot of, ads for pharmaceuticals might tell you that you've got a problem, right? And they exacerbate that story because it's easy to market to men's insecurities like that. And this is a bit beyond this conversation, I suppose, but like I see another big problem in terms of like the perpetuation of these stories. But to get back to your original question, yeah, I have seen a shift in women being like, hey, it's not, no problem, not a big deal. And a question that I pose to women that I work with is like, what if your partner said no to sex, right? What if your partner was just like not in the mood or not interested? Like, what would you react to? Like, how would you handle that situation? What reflections do you have about that, potential scenario in your head? And if a lot of women go, well, he's never said no, that's usually a cue to me that like, oh, maybe there's an opportunity here to reflect on that a bit more, right? Or if she says, well, I'd really be upset and really hurt by that. I go, okay, well, what about if he did the same thing to you, right? And you felt pressured into being sexual with him because he got really upset and really hurt by you not wanting to be sexual. It's like, oh, okay, there's opportunity to like explore that nuance a little bit more. So I'm definitely seeing a shift, at least, in my selection bias of people that are interested in the sexuality work. I'm not sure how it is in the mainstream, but I hope and I think that there is a bit of a shift, in that kind of cultural sense as well.
Very well said. Very well said. I know you specialize in providing sex coaching for men, but do you also provide? I personally believe there's a need for, like, even just what you said, that messaging to be kind of, or coaching to be provided to women as well. I'm just wondering, is that something that you do, or something that you may explore in the future?
Yeah, I do work with couples on occasion, and typically I'll work with a guy, I work with a man, and he'll be in a relationship, and I'll say to him, like, hey, bring your partner in for one of the sessions or two of the sessions, and let's do some couples work, or just educating to them both. Sometimes I'll kind of coach him how to educate his partner, or if he's dating, for example. I get a lot of guys who are like still dating and still looking for relationships, and an experience that they typically share with me is, they're really passionate and interested in sex, and they're doing this sexuality work, and they're having these really beautiful, positive experiences, which when they go and tell this new woman that they're dating, the feedback they get from her is like, whoa, I don't know any other guys doing that. like that's, you know, new to me. And they kind of get a little bit intimidated by that, or they're not really sure how to handle it, because they've had, you know, a lot of these women have had experiences with men that have just been maybe superficial, or just, you know, not very deep, or the sex has just been quite straightforward. It hasn't been, you know, inclusive of all these different practices that maybe I'm teaching this guy. So part of my coaching with those men as well is like kind of being a bit of a leader, in a sense of like educating the women that they're dating and being like, hey, this is what I'm interested in. This is what I'm really passionate about. I've kind of been reading this book. I'm working with this coach. You know, I'm doing this particular workshop or whatever it is. Like, if you're interested, I could teach you a little bit about it. You know, I can share some of the practices with you, and kind of inviting their partner in to their work, right? Rather than being like it being hierarchical and telling them what to do. I kind of think of it as like sexual leadership is a lateral kind of leadership, rather than hierarchical leadership, where you kind of invite someone in and lead by example. You kind of jump into the water first, and then you reach out your hand and say, come on in, the water's fine, like come and join me, it's safe in here. So that's the kind of framework that I use for men to kind of help educate the women around them, especially their sexual partners.
Actually, you just actually convinced me, because I was thinking of maybe directly providing it to women, but actually what you said, I think that's more effective, because you're indirectly teaching or coaching the women, but obviously through the guy, so he doesn't feel. Because my follow-up question was going to be, how do you deal with men who maybe feel intimidated if you're providing their partner the, you know, the coaching and the education, and he might feel like, you know, somewhat intimidated because obviously you're providing all this information, but then obviously if you're giving it to him via her or through her, and you're empowering him, so he's obviously possessed the correct vocabulary in order to teach her, actually, it's a kind of like a win-win. So actually, you sold me on that one. That's actually a better approach than doing it directly. So I stand corrected. Another question I had, I saw recently you had a couple of slides talking about the difference between erection and arousal. Do you mind explaining, just for the benefit of us people listening, is it the same? And if not, what are the differences between an erection and arousal for men?
Yeah, sure. So there's this conflation of erection and arousal. What that essentially means is, like, we typically think that if a man has an erection, it means he's turned on. When that isn't the case. There's actually what's known as arousal non-concordance, which is essentially just saying that there's a difference between physiological arousal, engorgement and erection, and psychological arousal or subjective arousal, which is like feeling turned on and desiring to have sex and being interested in sex. And you know, sometimes those two things overlap and they happen at the same time. You're turned on mentally and subjectively, and so you turned on physically and you get an erection, and those two things align. But there's a lot of instances where those two things don't align. So two examples that I share is morning wood, right? You wake up in the morning, you've got an erection. It usually doesn't mean that you're interested in having sex right then, right? It's just you've got an erection because maybe there's a peak of testosterone in the morning, or it's a carryover from REM-related erections. So during REM sleep, we typically get erections as well because the body's having just a physiological response. But often, I speak to a lot of men, they don't typically want to have sex first thing in the morning when they've got morning wood. It's just a biological response they're having. And then the other instance is the reverse of this, is like, hopefully guys can resonate with this. You've been in a situation where you're like really turned on by this woman that you're with or this partner that you're with, and you're interested in having sex, you desire to have sex, you want to be in that situation, and you want to be there and have sex with her, but you don't have an erection. Maybe you're struggling to get an erection. Maybe you're in your head a little bit about the fact that you don't have an erection in those moments. And you know, typically a lot of guys will label that erectile dysfunction, and that's kind of a different kettle of fish, and I want to maybe talk about that. But the phenomenon there of like being turned on and desiring to have sex but just not having an erection is an experience of arousal non-concordance. And again, something that, you know, I alluded to before is like women, for example, or just partners in general, can put a lot of stock.
Yeah, so hey, mate.
Sorry, man, I just cut out. So women and partners in general can put a lot of stock in whether a man does or doesn't have an erection, right? So for example, if he is flaccid and is soft, then one of the thoughts that might pop up for her is, oh, he isn't turned on by me right now. I'm not attractive enough, or I'm not hot enough. Again, there's this like, you know, placing of self-esteem in his response or in his desire or in his sexual experience. And I think that's slowly shifting as women become a little bit more self-empowered and explore their sexuality more. But that's still something that I see pop up a lot when I work with couples. And so, yeah, so and then, you know, the straightforward answer to that experience is just like, give yourself some time. Give yourself like 5-10 minutes to just like be in the moment, focus on pleasure, connect with your partner, maybe kiss, fondle, massage, touch, use some toys, use your tongue, use your hands, whatever it is. Just like keep the momentum going, keep the connection going, keep the pleasure, most importantly, going. And usually what will happen in those instances is your mind and your body will sync up. You know, the body will catch up because you've given yourself an opportunity to relax and enter your parasympathetic nervous system, which is what is responsible for erection and engorgement, right? You've got to be relaxed and allow for that relaxation to manifest as erection. And by doing that, you give yourself that opportunity to get an erection and align with the mental arousal as well. So, but typically a lot of people don't give themselves that opportunity because they get up in their head of like, holy shit, I don't have an erection. Sex is going to be a failure. I can't have sex now because I don't have an erection. That's a strong story for a lot of people, just in general, but a lot of men in particular is like, if I don't get an erection straight away, something's wrong with me and sex is going to be a failure and we're not going to be able to go ahead with it. I think, if I can lay the blame at one particular thing, I think pornography has a lot to answer for in regards to that particular experience, because when was the last time you saw a flaccid dick in pornography, right? Like it's always, his cock just bounces out of his trousers and it's just, there's just erection, right? There's no opportunity to explore the build-up of arousal, the flaccidness. Like your flaccid penis can experience the same amount of pleasure as an erect penis can because they've got the same amount of nerve endings. They don't change if you get more blood flow into the penis, so you can still experience the same amount of pleasure. But I get a lot of people going, what the fuck do I do with a flaccid penis? What do I do with a soft cock? I can't do anything with it, but there's so much that you can do with it. And I think the fact that we don't talk about that is doing a detriment to that particular experience where people shoot themselves in the foot without giving them time to catch up and sync up that physical arousal with the mental arousal.
That's right. Again, very well said. Just for the benefit of people who are joining, I'm speaking to Cam Fraser, who is a certified sexologist, a sex coach for men. He also has a background in psychology, tantric. Is it tantric counseling?
Tantric yoga teacher.
Sorry, tantric yoga teacher. And again, like I said, he specializes in performing or giving or providing sex coaching for men. He has a number of courses. He's the founder of the Karma Wellness Institute. He's also got a podcast which deals with masculinity, sexuality, and pleasure. You can check that out on anywhere where you've obviously got podcasts, as well as his YouTube channel. And obviously he's got a website for Cam Fraser where you can find out more about his courses and obviously the coaching that he provides. Do you also provide one-to-one coaching online? Is that?
I do. Yeah. I do one-to-one coaching online, and I've got a couple of courses that are self-paced.
Yeah. So he's also provides one-to-one coaching. Wanted to ask you about when you speak about like your evolution in your story. You mentioned how when I think it was during a period of like self-reflection, and there's certain stories or narratives that were maybe kind of like damaging or not like in line with what you thought a man or masculinity should be. How did you obviously because we've all been shaped in a certain social context, and we've been from like you mentioned like watching Friends and the Joey character and stuff like that, so that shapes your perception in terms of how a man should be, especially in relation to women. When you was in the period where you were self-reflecting, how did you identify which stories are kind of like damaging or not true masculinity? Was it, did you have help, or how did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I love this question, dude. Thank you for asking. The first thing was, I did have some help. So I had obviously my psychologist who was helping me discern which of those stories I agreed with and felt good to me, right? That was like a big barometer. It was like when I practice, that when I put that mask on of like performing this idea of masculinity in the sense that I do try and have sex with everything that walks, right? Like, how does that feel for me? Does that feel good? Does it feel bad, right? In a very simplistic way. Do I feel frustrated by that? Does it make me feel anxious? Do I feel celebratory in myself? Do I feel ease with myself? Like really starting to go from, does that feel good or bad, to really trying to delineate, like, how do I actually feel when I do that? Physically and also mentally. what is beneficial to my mental health, what's beneficial to my physical health. And so that was like one way of trying to discern which of those stories were of service to me and which of the ones like I wanted to let go of. But I also did like a lot of reading. I'm really interested in reading, and so I started reading like Bell Hooks, for example. Her book The Will to Change is fantastic. That helped me unpack some stories around masculinity. And then I won't list all the books I've read, but I just started reading. I started reading like a little bit of feminist theory. I started reading a little bit about the mythopoetic men's movement. I started reading about positive masculinity and like positive psychology. I started reading stuff with regards to sex education. There's books there that I've read around like indigenous masculinity and expressions of like indigeneity, which is really interesting, and just like started to recognize that masculinity in a singular doesn't exist, right? And that was my thought. I was like, this is what masculinity is. I have to be this particular way, and if I don't, then something's wrong with me. I'm less than a man. But what I kind of learned by doing reading and doing research and studying psychology, which I was really lucky to do, I kind of quickly realized masculinity exists in the hundreds, right? There's masculinities. In fact, there's so many different versions and expressions of throughout history, throughout cultures, different traditions. And so I stopped feeling like I needed to adhere to this one definition of masculinity and started really exploring. And again, the psychologist helped me feel like I had permission to do that, right? To explore other ways of expressing my masculinity. And again, using myself as a barometer, does that feel good to me, right? And even using other people as a barometer, like, do I have a better relationship with this person when I act in this particular way of expressing my masculinity versus this other way, right? So instead of being like maybe hyper masculine in the way that I thought that I needed to be and being like really macho and not talking about my emotions and not being very vulnerable and like trying to hide my insecurities, how do I relate to the men in my life when I do that? I had very surface level relationships. It was always oriented around alcohol. In fact, the only times that, that period of 5 years where I did have really deep conversations with my friends was under the influence of alcohol. We had, a D&M, a deep and meaningful conversation at like 1 o'clock in the morning. And then I'd wake up, the next day and I wouldn't remember it because I was too hungover, right? I'd had too much to drink. So like that wasn't healthy, right? That didn't feel good to me. And so, okay, I'll try a different version of masculinity. What if it is masculine to be vulnerable and to share about some stuff that's going on? What if I reframed strength to be, instead of it being stoic, to being expressive, right? What if that requires courage and strength? Okay, cool, I'll try that on for size. And I started to have deeper relationships with the men in my life, the men that wanted to meet me at that level, but the men that didn't, that were like, fuck you, man, what are you talking about? Like, this is some, they called me gay or called me a pussy or called me whatever. I quickly realized they're not the men that I want in my life, because, they weren't, open to hearing what I had to say about my own life, and they weren't being, supportive in that sense. So like that was I guess like that took me probably about 7 years to like fully like unpack all the stories, find the new men in my life that really are supportive of me, that do want to meet me on those levels, that I want to meet them on those levels. There's a period of time where I felt quite lonely, where I felt like I didn't have a lot of friends because my old friend group was really oriented around that like old school, old paradigm version of masculinity. And I stopped drinking for a little while as well. So, whenever they wanted to go out, it was always to a bar. And I was like, well, what's the point of me going to a bar if I'm not going to sit down and drink, right? So there was kind of an opportunity there for me to reassess who my friend group was. And so there was a period of time where I felt quite lonely, quite isolated, and had to do some work to reach out to new men and put myself in uncomfortable situations, going to, a new men's group or a new activity where there was men who were doing the work and were wanting to, have better relationships with the men in their lives. And I'm speaking about men specifically, but like also women as well. I had to find new ways to talk to women and meet women and interact with them and engage with them in a way that wasn't because I just wanted to have sex with them, which is what I had been doing before, right? That was like my only real relationship with women, I was just trying to get in their pants. And so I had to change the way that I viewed women as human beings, as friends, as people in my life that I was inspired by and had a lot of like aspirations to be like as well. And so that was another, like I said, another big kind of piece of the puzzle. And that all took about 7 years. And you know what? I'm still kind of doing it today. I'm now a father. You know, I've got a 2-year-old boy, and he's just about to turn 2. And I'm unpacking stories about what it means to be a dad. You know, and like, how do I want to show up as a role model for my son? That's stuff I've never had to think about before, right? Because I've never had a son before. I've never been a dad before. So now I'm kind of still going on this journey. And I imagine I'll go on it for the rest of my life of like, how do I want to show up? How do I want to model masculinity? How do I want to model a relationship, a healthy relationship with my wife, so that I've got my son seeing that? Yeah, so I feel like I've rambled a little bit, but like it's an ongoing process. I wouldn't say that I've kind of come to a settled point, and I don't think I ever will. I think there's always more things to kind of learn and unpack. And the more I speak to people from different ethnicities and cultures, the more I understand, holy shit, I've got only one kind of really narrow perspective of the world as a man. And I learned so much from speaking with, with men of different experiences as well.
No, it's an evolution, and you're definitely evolving. And even from what you've said, you could clearly, I'm sure people can hear and be inspired and admire the evolution, the journey that you've taken. And also, I'm also quite intrigued by your self-determinism, and also you being very self-reflective. And like you said, thinking about, okay, what serves you, and the things, if something or someone doesn't serve you, then you're actually, that's a question. Was it comfortable for you, even at a relatively young age? You mentioned, I think it's at 19, 20 when you had your injury, and then you started to kind of like look into like Eastern theologies and stuff like that. Was it, again, it's still a relatively young age, was it easy for you to kind of disconnect from some of your friends? Because a lot of men, even in their 30s, still want validation, acceptance from their male peer groups. I'm just wondering, how was that for you to kind of like, where you realize, again, some of your mates weren't serving you because obviously they're just drinking, or just their version of masculinity it's not aligned with what you now consider to be like healthy masculinity, shall we say? How was that for you to kind of like be like, F off you guys, or not F off completely, but you're not benefiting me, so maybe we kind of need to go our separate ways?
Yeah, it was painful, man. It was painful to say goodbye to people that had been in my life for 7, 10 years. I'd gone to high school with them. Some of them I met in university. It wasn't easy. And like I said before, I felt the pain of feeling lonely and feeling isolated and feeling like I didn't have a lot of friends. And that was a period of my life where I was lucky enough to I've got a really good relationship with my brother. So it was really nice to kind of have him in my life. I've got a good relationship with my dad, but he's like an old school Scotsman. So sticks his head in the sand and doesn't really talk about his emotions too much. So I didn't really lean on him too much during that time, but my brother I definitely leaned on, and he and I did some traveling together and managed to connect at a bit of a deeper level. So that was really lovely. But I just kind of had at the time, I kind of had this inclination of I want to go into psychology, I want to go into therapy, I want to go into a helping profession. And my mentality was if I can just push myself to have as many different experiences as possible, if I can go to South America and explore plant medicine, if I can go to Southeast Asia, ordain as a Buddhist monk in northern Thailand, which is something I did, spend a bit of time, in Singapore, spend a bit of time in Vietnam, and these other kind of, have these experiences. And if I can bring that back to my profession as a counselor or as a therapist, I'm going to be able to relate to a lot more people. So I was, in a sense, a little bit self-serving. I was like, okay, I've got to do this for my career. I've got to do this for where I want to head in my life. Here's where I want to get. Here's what I aspire to. How can I get there? And part of that was pushing myself to my limits mentally and physically, so that I can bring that back to my work, and so that I can show up for a diverse array of people in my work. So I think that was a bit of a driving factor for me to let go of some of the friendships, was to have some men's coaches might say, have a purpose, right? I kind of felt like I had a purpose. I felt solid in that. I was like, this is where I want to go with my life. This is what I want to do in the world. Everything else is kind of secondary to that a little bit, and so some of those friendships fell by the wayside because they didn't align with where I was going with my life. And so, so that was probably something that really, was the kind of rudder in that isolated loneliness storm. I was kind of no, this is the direction that I want to head. Maybe I was a little bit blown off course, but I still had this trajectory that I was heading on. And I think that was what got me through in the end.
I respect that. I think in many professions, especially for one to be quite successful, especially if you're doing something quite unique, you need to have a level where a set of a sense of single-mindedness. I think you definitely got that, and yeah, you lose friends on the way, and I'm sure even some of your friends, or like your day ones, as we call them in the UK, they will be watching you from a distance, and I think it's where, as long as obviously the door's open, I'm sure it will be. In your case, they'll come to you because what I like as well about the way you can converse in a very intellectual manner, and then you go straight to just the guy from the pub, but it sounds like that's how striking because it's like having a really intellectual conversation and you just bring slang in. It's just like it's good because again, it makes you more relatable, especially for guys. Because I think one of the challenges I've found is that again, you want to speak to people, you want to relate to people. You don't want to come across as like like holier than thou or kind of speaking above, like using all these technical jargon. So that's what I do appreciate also with like the way you kind of communicate. It's like it's very accessible, especially for guys. I think like even when you're talking like whiskey dick and sometimes being flaccid and stuff like that, those type of terminology, I think in some circles they might find it a bit, oh, that's a bit, I don't know what the word that they'll call it, but I think especially for men, that's kind of like how we speak, especially in behind closed doors. So yeah, I do. I'm smirking just in case why you were smirking because I like the way you was going from different styles. One question actually I did want to ask, and we did touch on it when I was on your podcast. You spoke about like you could say the evolution of your image. So when you came back, I'm not sure where it was, whether it's from South America or when you initially came back or started doing your coaching and you had that long hair and your look was very different to what it is now. Can you just, again, just for the benefit of people listening, can you just touch on that journey and why you changed in terms of, especially people see your old image with the long hair. The beard was a bit long, kind of like a Jesus looking figure, not in a, and then now it's like like you want to be the next Superman, but Clark Kent. But can you talk about that evolution and why you changed your image and how that's helped your coaching business?
Yeah, so similar to one of the themes that I've touched on here is I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be ostracized. I wanted to be part of the in group. And so I was teaching yoga, and I was quite into the spiritual space. I'd done a bit of plant medicine and I was like, into facilitating workshops and things like that. And so I saw the other men in the space have long hair and have beards and have, in the chat. Hey, he's back.
Oh, you're back. Yeah, sorry, it cut off when just when you started talking. Sorry, so I don't
That's all
know
good.
how far you got to.
No worries, man. I'll start again. So
Yes, please.
my fear of fitting in was what led me to grow my hair long and to grow my beard long and to wear open flowing shirts and to wear mala beads, because that's what I saw other men, in the space doing, other yoga teachers, other male workshop facilitators. I just like, again, that fear, right? That's that theme of fear throughout my life of like not being seen as one of the in crowd or as not being part of the group. So that's what kind of pushed me to do it, because I thought that was what was expected of me. But then I kind of quickly realized and reflected on like, well, that's actually not how I really want to show up. That's really not my authentic expression of myself. I kind of lean a little bit more academic. I kind of lean a little bit more, you might say, corporate or professional, right? Like I'm professional in like a very stereotypical sense. And so I went on a bit of a rebrand, you know, a personal rebrand, and started wearing some more button-up shirts and kind of cut the hair off and trim the beard down a bit. And you know, as I kind of stepped into that version of myself or expression of myself, aesthetic, you know, of myself, which felt a lot more aligned and much more comfortable for me, I quickly realized that that was what was resonating with people, right? It was like this fact that I was being genuine and authentic. Felt a little bit like I was putting on a bit of a mask when I had the long hair and I was trying to play this role of like the yoga guru type guy, when that isn't really me. But I thought that was what I needed to be in order to present sexuality information. But now, you know, I try and just be a regular dude. You know, I've kind of done a bit of reading, I've done a bit of research, I've done a bit of study. So I use some words from that space. But as you kind of mentioned before, I do try and just keep it down to earth. I try and keep it like pretty grounded and pretty straightforward. And so I kind of look that way as well, because that's what feels good for me. That's what, you know, is more aligned and more comfortable and more genuine in terms of like how I show up in the world. So there's some other things in there as well. Like you know, I went on this like, kind of like reflection piece of you know, I was really hyper vigilant of how much I talked about sex originally. You know, when I was teaching yoga, when I was doing like that type of like, when I first kind of stepped foot into this space, I was like really concerned about not being the creepy sex guy, you know, the guy who talks about sex and is interested and passionate about sex. And like, that was like, you know, and I didn't want to become you know, coming across as like having an agenda. You know, I didn't want to like have people think that I was talking about sex because I just, you know, wanted to have sex with everyone. And that was like something I was really cognizant of. And I tried to like mitigate that by not really talking too much about sex, or like talking about it in a very like spiritual way, and trying to mask like and compensate for that fear that I had. And then I, you know, had a reflection on it, and I was like, you know what? I'm not a creepy guy. I'm not trying to talk about sex to have sex with everyone. I don't have a hidden agenda here. It's just something that I'm really interested in, really passionate about. It's had a really transformative effect on my life, and I know that it'll have transformative effect on other people's lives. So I'm just going to start talking about it much more openly. And when I did that, much more people started resonating with my work, right? Because I was being authentic. I wasn't hiding behind anything or trying to be someone or you know, be compensating for a fear that I had. I was just like, fuck it. You know, I started kind of doing the same thing that I did in you know, previous years of my life. In the most compassionate way possible, I stopped really caring what other people think. You know, I don't care if you think that I'm a creepy, sex crazed dude, because I don't think that about myself. And I honestly don't really care what you think about me, right? Like that's the mentality I've had in the most, like I said, I try and say that the most compassion possible, but that's like what I'm passionate about is sexuality and pleasure and intimacy and helping men explore these things in a shame-free, non-judgmental way. And so when I really stepped up into that, that's when my work and my coaching really started to like see much more engagement, and people started to resonate with that much more because I was just being myself.
Nice. I think, yeah, I think with, because obviously we're both in the same field, and I'll be honest, even with, I'm glad obviously that's why I wanted to speak to you, because obviously it's nice to see another guy that's doing great work in this field. But I'm also quite cautious when any of guys in this field, because a lot of guys, some have ulterior motives, and it's a thing where even like, for example, when you reached out to me, I think it was like a couple of years ago when you first bought my book, my first instinct is I need to see social proof, and then reputation. I want to see like, okay, what's this person about? Because I'll be honest, I'm quite I definitely would. I'm careful not to co-sign, especially another guy, because I've had experiences where guys that I've known have done terrible things, or where they've used, not even that I've done anything with them, they've said they've used my book to say, oh, I'm going to open up like a workshop of kunyaza in this country, and I've got Habib's permission. And they're just selling all these sex services, which again, if you're doing your own thing, do it, but don't start attach my name to it. So I'm quite skeptical of guys in this field. But one thing obviously I've seen obviously with your work is not only the authenticity, but obviously there's a reputation behind it, and the consistency as well. And I think that's something that even guys, even women as well, who may have that initial perception of just a creepy guy, I think when they actually see the consistency of your work, then obviously those fears will soon subside. I had a quick question, because touching on when you were talking about like tying into like the perception of like this creepy sex guy. how do you, or do you teach like sexual ethics and sexual discipline? Because that's something which I've struggled to teach. Like, for example, I have a course or it's talking about sexual pleasure or female orgasms or squirting. Guys are easy buying for guys. But to bring in the importance of sexual discipline and sexual ethics or intimacy and stuff like that, it's quite difficult to sell to guys, although it's very important. How do you, and I'm sure you do, but how do you tie that into like your courses and or market that to your male clients?
Yeah, I do my best to try and integrate it into the conversations around pleasure and around, you know, sexual experiences. You know, like, so one of the here's an example, I suppose. I'll talk to guys about boundaries, you know, and about being able to respect boundaries. But the way that I'll frame it is, the stronger you are with your boundaries and the stronger you're able to like hold your partner's boundaries, the more pleasure you're able to experience, because you know these are the parameters within which you can like fully show up, right? It's because you know that's a hard boundary right there. Great, I can get right up to that boundary because I know exactly where it is, right? It's not vague, and I've asked the right questions. I know exactly how far I can push. Great, I can show up 110% within that container, within that boundaried space. But if you're not strong with your boundaries, you're not asking the questions, you're not being forthcoming and trying to get that information from your partner, you don't know where those boundaries are. And so you might be like, oh, I don't know how far I can push. I don't know if I, like, and it becomes a little bit trepidatious, right? But if you're fucking clear and you know exactly how far you can go, you show up 110% within that space. And that's what gives you the capacity to like surrender into that, for your partner to surrender into that. Like it fosters much more safety, it fosters much more pleasure, and it fosters much more openness and freedom. So like, that is an example of how I'll get guys to like invest in the discipline and the ethics, right? Or like the boundaries and the consent work, is because I try and keep pleasure positive is like my approach, right? It's like, let's focus on the pleasure version of it, not on like the, well, if you don't do these, you're going to be a, you know, an abuser, right? Which is also true, but I try not to lead with that, and I try and lead with the pleasure aspect of it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I like that approach. Just for the benefit of anyone who's joined the last 10 to 15 minutes, or maybe 20 minutes, I'm speaking to Cam Fraser, who's Australia's leading sex coach for men. He's also a certified sexologist and the founder of Karma Wellness Institute, and he's also got a course, well, many courses for men. And one of his courses that I want to talk about is Outperform the Pornstar. Outperform the Pornstar, which is a 6-week course for men. So, Cam, do you mind first talking a little bit about what that course entails and how you came up with the name Outperform the Pornstar?
Well, I didn't actually come up with the name. It was actually a name that was gifted to me by a colleague of mine way back when I was, before I even really thought about even putting a course together. He said, hey man, here's a name that you can just have. It's called Outperform a Pornstar. And I was like, dude, that's so good. I'm going to pocket that and use it at a later date. So I credit him. But the idea behind the name is like, it's a little bit tongue in cheek, right? Because this idea of performance, which I've kind of already alluded to in my own personal story, is not very beneficial or not very conducive to like good, pleasurable, mutually satisfying sex. In fact, it leads to a lot of anxiety and a lot of like stereotypical sexual difficulties. So the name of the course is to really like catch people's eye and to be a bit like clickbaity, I suppose, and I fully acknowledge that. But it's to target the guys who do think that porn sex is the epitome of good sex, when it, as a matter of fact, is not, and a lot of it's fake. I do a lot of porn literacy in my workshops, and so the start of the course is like collecting a bunch of quotes and interviews from very well-known porn stars, talking about how the sex they're having on screen, the sex that we see, is actually not very pleasurable for them. It's actually, some of the guys are trying to distract themselves so they can last for 45 minutes to get the shooting done. Other guys are like biting the inside of their cheek to cause pain so that they don't ejaculate so quickly. Like, just not pleasurable sex. It's not good sex. And so that's how the course starts. And then the idea is like subverting this idea of performance. And instead of being performance oriented with regards to sex, we shift to pleasure oriented approach to sex. So that's what the course is about, is to kind of take you on this journey from unpacking why we think porn sex is the epitome of good sex, and why, we think performing and, lasting long and pumping away like a porn star and trying to like have a big dick and all this stuff. Like, where did that all come from? It's like a little bit of narrative therapy, essentially, like unpacking all that, why it's really invasive in our thoughts about sexuality, especially as men, why it's not serving us, why it's actually leading to shitty sex with our partners, and then shifting to like, what are some positive stories that we can, you know, adhere to? What are some positive examples of sexuality? How do we explore pleasure? What's our resistance to pleasure? Because a lot of men are very good at like sexual gratification. They're really good at just like getting the job done, jerking off, ejaculating, having that little dopamine squirt, but they're not very good at like fully embodied, full body experiences of pleasure, right? They're very localized to their genitals. They don't really know how to explore it in the rest of their body. So that's what the course is. It kind of takes you on this journey over 6 weeks from that really performative space to a much more pleasure-oriented space, which begins with yourself. And then the last 2 weeks of the course are like, how can you share this with another person, right? So, you know, typically it's framed as like, how can you share this with a woman? That's the type of men that I work with, is straight dudes. But you know, the stuff's applicable to men that have sex with men. But it's like, you know, how can you be communicative with your partner? How can you ask your partner about their boundaries? How can you communicate about your fantasies and your desires? How can you watch porn together and get ideas and feel inspired by other people's sexual experiences? How can you explore pleasure with your partner? Maybe there's an anatomy issue that needs to be rectified. So I do a bit of education around erotic anatomy and stuff. So that's kind of like the crux of the course, is to go from performance to pleasure, firstly with yourself, and then to pleasure specifically with another person. And it's, yeah, I'm really proud of it, actually. There's a lot of really great stuff in there.
Great overview. And when does the course start?
It's evergreen, so you can start it today, or you can start it whenever you like, and you've got lifetime access to it. So it's a self-paced course. It does, you know, encompass about 6 weeks worth of content, and if you go through it, you'll get released each week the new modules. But you can do it again and again and again. You know, you buy it once, you've got lifetime access to all the content.
And if people want to purchase the course, it's on your website. Is it thecamfraser.com?
It's cam-fraser.com. So, and I've got the link in my bio on Instagram, and yeah, I'm usually promoting it every couple of weeks. So you'll see a post about it if you follow me. But yeah, just reach out, send me a message if you want the direct link. I can send that through. That's easy enough.
Great. Yeah. Whilst I know we're coming to the hour, just gone over the hour, but I've just got a couple of questions, if you don't mind, that people have asked me to ask you. Is there any treatment for premature ejaculation?
Yeah, so I am hesitant to say that there's one particular treatment for premature ejaculation. Same thing with erectile dysfunction, because it could be due to a number of different factors. One of the most common suggestions that I give to people with premature ejaculation is to slow your breathing down, so deep diaphragmatic breathing, and then in conjunction with that, slow your stimulation down as well. So you can practice this by yourself. So when you're masturbating or self-pleasuring, really slow down, slow the breathing down, deepen the breath. And then when you're touching your own body, when you're touching your genitals, stimulating your genitals, really slow stroking, slow touching, light touching, so that you're giving yourself an opportunity to get familiar with the buildup of arousal, right? So you can pay attention to, say, if 10 out of 10 is ejaculation and 1 out of 10 is like no arousal whatsoever, you're familiar with how quickly you take to build up to 10. Maybe you are, you know, able to practice building up to a 7 and just kind of staying there at a 7 for a couple of moments. Maybe that just requires you to take a few breaths and to slow down. So essentially, you're just learning more about your buildup of arousal, so that when you're with another person, you can communicate to them, hey, I just need to slow down a bit, or I just need to take a break a bit here. Like, it gives you a bit more information to communicate with them about you needing to slow down. And once you've kind of got the hang of that, then it's just practice after that. And like I said, that's like one strategy, and I'm hesitant to say that's the only strategy. There's plenty of other things that you can do, because it might depend on why you have premature ejaculation. So yeah, that's the first thing that I would suggest.
And if you want more information, sign up to your courses. That's where they can find out more.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're really concerned, like, go and see a GP. That's the first thing that I say to anyone that reaches out to me, is like, go get a GP's opinion, because it could be a medical issue.
Yeah. So next question, do you have any non-penetrative sex advice for a woman to give pleasure to a man if both are clueless, please?
Yeah. So here's a general rule of thumb that I like to suggest is, so like using your hands is to start at his genitals. So like start at his cock and, wake it up, so with a little bit of massaging, with a little bit of touching, maybe with a little bit of stroking, build that arousal in his genitals, maybe until he's got an erection. And then once you've woken his genitals up, once you've woken his cock up, move out from there. So like start really localized with his cock, and then move your way out into other areas of your body. So oftentimes when we start to have sex with a partner, so I'm talking about a heterosexual couple here, a lot of guys, because when they masturbate, they go straight for their genitals. When they have sex, they go straight for their partner's genitals. And a lot of women, when they masturbate, they typically don't start at their genitals. They build themselves up to their genitals. And so when they're touching their male partner, they'll start at his peripheries. And there's like a miscommunication piece there, right? Because he's going, my cock's right here, why don't you touch that? And she's going, whoa, slow down. I don't want you to go straight for penetration. And so the golden rule here is don't touch your partner the way that you like to be touched. Touch your partner the way that they like to be touched. So the suggestion I give to men is start at your partner's peripheries and work your way towards her genitals. And for women, the suggestion I give is start at your partner's cock and work your way out. So that's like my general rule of thumb. And like that could look like just giving some, sensual oil massage on the other parts of his body, right? Waking up his nipples might be really beneficial, like the chest, whatever he really enjoys touching, like just get him to give you feedback, right? So in the moment, be like, is this really feeling good? Like, what do you enjoy? Like, just give me something, right? Give me some sort of feedback about like how this is going. And he might be like, "Wow, that feels amazing when you touch me on my chest or on my belly," right? And if he's been, if he's built that pleasure with you, built that arousal with you, a lot of it's going to feel good, because that's what happens when we're turned on. Stuff that we usually don't feel a lot of pleasure from when we're in that like sober state, when we're in like a heightened state of arousal, a lot of that stuff feels really good. So that's right. That's why I say kind of like build his arousal in his genitals first, and then move your way out and start exploring his body. And you'll probably notice with him as well that there are parts of his body that he really enjoys being touched.
Great answer. Very comprehensive. And sorry, just a couple of quick questions. I know going over time, but you mentioned obviously through your studies, you realize that there's different types of masculinity. It's not just one type of masculinity, which I completely agree with. Now, when you're doing your coaching, do you present like an ideal, or not like maybe like an ideal form of masculinity for your clients, or do you kind of tell them about different forms of masculinity? I'm just wondering in terms of how do they get to the stage, especially if they're not someone who is well learned and happy to kind of read and explore different types of cultures and different types of masculinity. They want like a cookie cutter approach. Like, tell me what is like healthy masculinity. Do you present that to them, or do you kind of lead them on a journey to kind of explore within themselves what's healthy to them? Or I'm just wondering, how do you go about that with your clients?
Yeah, I try not to be prescriptive with my talking about masculinity. I usually try and take them on a bit of a journey. Something that I ask them is, what does masculinity mean for you? What makes you feel masculine? And very often when I ask that question and I give guys permission to just like really speak into it, they don't share with me things that are very stereotypically masculine, right? Like you might be expecting, when I chop wood, that makes me feel masculine, right? When I'm like, out with the fellas or whatever it is, right? I don't get a lot of those answers. What I do get is much more, the answers are much more sensitive, and they're much more like nuanced. And it's like when I am, doing this writing, I feel really masculine. Or when I'm like on stage performing, I feel really masculine, right? And I try to get a bit more clearer on like, if they want to explore their masculinity, I kind of go, well, what does masculinity like feel like? Give me some adjective words, because like we said before, masculinity is like a bit amorphous. There isn't like one way of doing masculinity. It can be like, kind of whatever you want it to be. But I ask them like, do you want to feel more assertive, right? Do you want to feel more dominant? Do you want to feel more content and stable and grounded, not get buffered so much by other people's opinions? Do you want to feel more, self-esteem? Like, what is it that you're working towards? And if those things align with your idea of masculinity, that's great. But I'm not necessarily helping you find, a way to be more masculine, I'm helping you find a way to be more assertive in the bedroom. But if that makes you feel more masculine, that's awesome. So I try and just kind of take it down one layer into like, what are some things we can tangibly work on together? And if that by proxy makes you feel more masculine, that's amazing.
Great answer. Great answer. And I would like an expression which you, or a phrase which you used when we last spoke, which I love. Intentionally exclusive, about your work being like targeted, not specifically only, but targeted towards heterosexual white male. I think in men in Australia. Not to say that you don't cater for others, but you talk about in terms of having more tailored or focused approach with the service that you're providing. What are the common challenges or the unique challenges, if any, that subgroup have compared to like maybe other demographics that you worked with? So like for heterosexual white Australian men, what are common or unique, intimacy and sex issues that group you think potentially has compared to others?
Yeah, you know, something that I notice a lot with like this demographic, like my demographic, people that have my lived experience, is, you know, there's a feeling that like, and whether this is true or not, this is a feeling that a lot of these men have, is like they feel like they're under attack, right? Like they feel like, oh, I can't be masculine, or I can't be myself, right? There's like a lot of rhetoric, particularly from conservatives and people in like kind of that, you know, side of the political spectrum, that are like espousing this idea that it's like not okay to be a straight white male, right? That's a very like, you know, divisive talking point. And whether that's true or not, like I'm not here to kind of talk about that specifically. What I do notice is that a lot of men feel some sort of trepidation around that. A lot of the men that I work with do feel like, well, I don't want to be like, you know, I don't want to do the wrong thing. I don't want to be an abuser. I don't want to breach consent. Like, what do I do? How do I, you know, and so there's confusion, and there's disorientation, and there's like a desire to want to be good and be a good guy, and you know, be a nice guy, and they maybe have a bit of a warped reference for what that actually means. And so there's this, you know, this fear that I have to speak to, because, and I notice it a little bit in myself. I'm kind of much more blasé about it. I don't really think, if I'm sure personally, I don't really think masculinity is under attack, and I don't really buy into that rhetoric. But I recognize that a lot of guys do feel like that. So I do try and speak to them about that idea, and kind of alleviate that fear a little bit, and give them permission to just be themselves. And, you know, there's some ways of doing it in a really healthy way, and ways that respect other people's boundaries and that are consensual. But that's one, like, you know, quote unquote unique aspect, I suppose, to like that particular demographic, is that particular fear. You know, I usually try and share with them, from my understanding, other demographics experiences of feeling alienated and ostracized, and like they can't be themselves, to try and build a little bit of that bridge and solidarity, to be, you know, to kind of have a light bulb moment for these guys to be like, oh, holy shit, that's how this group of people feel. Wow. Okay, great. I can, you know, okay, I can kind of sympathize and empathize with them a bit more. Like I've got a bit more of an understanding of that, because they have that visceral feeling now. So that's like an interesting space to navigate. You know, it's kind of like, if we want to name it, it's like privilege, right? Like I work on, you know, guys' understandings of their privilege as straight white dudes in the world. And that's something I still do my own work on. The other kind of like, you know, thing that I notice is, because these guys exclusively have sex with women for the most part. I have worked with some guys that, you know, are, you know, they identify as like hetero-flexible, or they're like, you know, I do like having sex with women.
What? I've never heard that term. What's that term? Did you call it?
So they
Heteroflexible.
identify as hetero-flexible, yeah. So they are predominantly straight, right? They're like, yeah, I like having sex with women. I want to have sex with women. You know, but I'm curious, right? And so there's this like, oh, what's it like to have a threesome with you know, a woman and another guy, right? Or what's it like to go to a nude yoga class where it's just the men in that class, right? Like there's maybe a desire to just like explore sexuality, maybe not explicitly, maybe they don't want to actually have sex with men, but just to like be in a sexual space with other men, maybe to be in an erotic space with other men, to just notice like, oh, that is, you know, empowering. That does make me feel, you know, good about myself. Or maybe there's an opportunity to be, you know, a bit more exploratory with other men in an erotic space. So there's and it's a bit of a controversial term because a lot of people think that it's alluding to someone who's secretly gay, which is a pretty horrible story that a lot of, like, for example, bisexual men experience. There's also, like, some people think that it's bi erasure. I think it's just adding more nuance to this spectrum of sexuality. But I have had some guys who are like, I want to have a threesome with another guy. I want my girl and another guy to have sex and just see how it goes. And so, we kind of talk about, like, well, there's another guy in the space. Does that mean that you're completely straight, or does it mean that there's some flexibility there? And usually they go, well, it means there's some flexibility. I desire to have sex with another guy in that space, right? I don't want to have sex with him. I want us to both have sex with my partner, but there's another guy there. So is that completely 100% straight, or is there, like, some flexibility there? So that's kind of what the term means for me anyway.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Because I don't know where I was going with this, but, like, I forgot where I was going with that.
Oh, sorry, you were talking about, sorry, I should have cut you off. About the heterofluidity, you were speaking about. Oh, Lord, totally forgot. Sorry.
That's all good.
It's actually good. Apologies. But anyway, going back just to the final question before we wrap it up. What are the main? Actually, I've got, sorry, two questions. The first question is in relation to male-female relationships. What is it that you like women to understand about male anxiety or male insecurity? Like the biggest one, like the one that you like for them to kind of remember or take away, other than anything you've kind of said. You said quite a few things, but is there anything else that you like women to kind of take away in terms of appreciating or understanding the complexities of, like, whether it's performance anxiety or some of the myths around male sexuality or arousal and desire? Is there anything else? Or you could just expand on something that you kind of said, because you have said quite a few, to be fair.
Yeah, one of the things that I think it's important for women to be aware of with regards to men is that a lot of men are afraid of or anxious about not being good at sex, of not being a good lover, of not being able to give you orgasms. And I know that, like, sounds controversial because of the orgasm gap, for example, but a lot of guys are pretty concerned with being shit in bed. And unfortunately, what they think good in bed looks like is what they see in porn. They don't have a lot of education around, like, how to be good in bed, but they're very concerned about that. And like I said before, a lot of guys are really good at, like, the gratification side of things, just getting off. They're not very good at the pleasure side of things. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why I think a lot of women will fake their orgasms, is because a lot of guys are, like, trying they're trying to give their partner orgasms. They're trying to do a particular technique, or they're hyper focusing on it. And because a lot of women don't feel comfortable kind of speaking up in the bedroom, they pretend to be experiencing a lot of pleasure for his sake. And so, if you can acknowledge as a woman that your male partner is probably, like, pretty concerned with your pleasure, he just doesn't really know how to go about it. He doesn't really know how to approach it. He's probably very insecure about asking for help, about asking for your, what turns you on, like, because implicitly that kind of acknowledges or implies that he doesn't know everything, that he doesn't really know what he's doing, that he needs help, right? There's the stereotype of men not asking for help, right? Of men not asking for directions, right? And that, I mean, it's a stereotype for a reason, because a lot of guys do find that really difficult. And that also goes to sex as well. So a lot of guys, one of the bane of my life is trying to get men to do work with me, because if they do reach out to me for work, within that reaching out, there is an acknowledgement implicitly that they need help, that they don't know everything, that they need to ask for advice and ask for guidance. And so for a guy to do that, it's like a pretty vulnerable thing to do, and it really shines a light on things that he's insecure about. And so that's what I think women, could acknowledge a little bit more of, is, like, a lot of guys feel insecure about being shit in bed, and they do feel vulnerable asking for help and asking for what turns you on and what your boundaries are, and initiating those conversations, because it alludes to this idea that they aren't all knowing and all knowledgeable when it comes to sex, and they don't really know what they're doing. So acknowledging that anxiety can be really helpful.
Amazing. You actually answered my last questions about men asking for help. So well done. It's like you read my mind, but no. No, honestly, well done. No, brilliant, brilliant. I'm definitely going to save this. A couple of people have asked me that I will be saving this. Again, just anything else that you want to plug, promote. Again, obviously, people can. I'm going to say this can have people can check obviously your Instagram page and the link to your website with all of your courses, your podcast, the 6-week Outperform a Pornstar course for men, and any other services that you're offering. But is there anything else that you want to plug before we wrap this up?
Not really, man. You've kind of covered all those bases. I just want to encourage people to be curious, you know, like that's something I always try and advocate for, is just like be curious about your sexuality, be curious about others, be curious about your partner's body, like about their boundaries. Just like try and cultivate your curiosity around sexuality. Don't just follow the same sexual scripts that you think you're supposed to be following. Have a bit of like, have a bit of curiosity. That's the word that comes to mind.
Bit of curiosity. Nice one. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Cam, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure. Keep up the good work. Again, I'm going to save this, and obviously tag you. So obviously people can go and follow you, check out your phenomenal work. Again, thank you again for giving me the hour or so. And thanks to everyone for joining. This is Cam Fraser, Australia's leading sex and intimacy coach. He's also a certified sexologist, tantric and yoga practitioner. He's also got a podcast and a 6-week course for men, Outperform a Pornstar. You can check that out on Cam's website, cam-fraser.com. Obviously, you've got hopefully a link to his Instagram page where you can have everything that he's doing. So yeah, go and check him out, and thank you everyone for joining. I'll speak to you soon, Cam. Take care.
Thanks,
Good morning.
Hey, cheers,
Bye. Take care, mate.
Bye.
Bye.